Welcome everyone to the webinar. We're going to discuss 15 ways to focus through boring reading material. I'm Paul Novak, the founder of Iris Reading, and if you have any questions, you can reach me at paul@irisreading.com. Let's get right into the information right now. I know it's very tough if you're a student or let's say you're working and you've got to read through long, boring reading material. Maybe it's your textbooks, maybe it's legal stuff. That kind of material is tough to read, so I want to give you some information on how you can actually focus through that material, because the fact of the matter is, if you're a college student, you have to read through those textbooks because you got to score well on your test. If you're in the workplace and you've got boring material to read, your job is dependent on you being able to read through that material. So our first step really is just accepting the fact that it is boring material. We don't need to. One way you could try to make it interesting. That is a tip, but sometimes it's very, very tough. Here are some ways that you can try to make the information interesting. If you're a student, maybe looking up the topic either on Netflix or YouTube and see if there's some kind of a documentary on that topic. Or maybe there's another instructor, another professor out there that has also given that kind of a lecture on that particular topic. You'd be amazed at how some instructors can make a topic very, very boring just by the way that they teach it. Some books can be the same way. Some books can be written in a way that makes it very dry to read. So sometimes, and also the fact some of us are very visual learners, so when we see something by video rather than through book, sometimes it's easier for us to comprehend. So that's one way you can try to make the information interesting. Sometimes I realize that can be tough, but another way that you can try to get through and focus through boring material, you want to ask yourself, why am I reading this? Having a goal and a very specific purpose in mind, and it's got to be more than, well, I got to read this because it's required by my job. It's got to be more direct than, I got to read this because it was assigned in school. It's got to be very specific. Well, why do you have to read it for school? Is it because you're going to have a test? Do you have to do the questions at the end of the chapter? What are those questions? If it was really boring reading material and I have to answer questions at the end, I'm going to be looking at those questions first because I want to spend as little time on this chapter as possible. So having a goal and knowing your purpose is extremely important before you start reading it. Now, another thing you want to do before you start reading this boring material is scan before you start reading it. If you have material that is very, very uninteresting, the worst thing you could do is just read it beginning to end. So I want you to scan it, and here's how you can scan through the material. First of all, read your introduction and your summary. Why? So you can get an idea. The introduction is going to tell you, here's what this is going to be about. Summary is obviously telling you, hey, here's what we just covered. Another way to scan through your reading is to look at all the headings and subheadings of the chapter. Another way to do it is to maybe read the first sentences of every paragraph, because the first sentence tends to be the main idea. So if you can get an idea of what this is going to be about, and you already know your purpose, why am I reading this, then when you start reading, it's going to be a lot easier to read, and it might not be as boring as you think. And even if it is boring, at least you know what you need to get. You already know what to expect, so it's a little easier for your brain. Now, another common thing, especially with speed reading, you always want to use your hand or a pen while reading. Now, I know this is not as practical if you're reading on the computer screen, but if you've got, a magazine article or anything, let's say it's a physical book in front of you, using your hand or a pen will help guide your eyes, and it will help you focus on the material, even though it may in fact be boring material for you. Now, another tip is to use the read and recall method. What this involves is reading a paragraph and then immediately taking a note based on what that paragraph was about. And usually the note is very, very short. Maybe it's a word or two, or maybe a short phrase. Now, if you have very short paragraphs like a line of dialogue, you don't have to do it on every single short paragraph. But when the paragraph is longer, the moment you're done reading it, you have to write something down. Now, why is this useful for improving your focus? If you know you have to write something down, guess what? You're going to pay a little more attention to it. If your goal is to write something down after every long paragraph, you'll naturally pay more attention because you're going to be looking for the keywords, the main ideas. So try to use the read and recall method to help you focus through this boring material. And also make sure you're taking breaks. Breaks are very important because our mind can only focus on a particular task for about 20-25 minutes before the level of focus starts quickly deteriorating. So it's a good idea to maybe set aside scheduled breaks, maybe at the end of a section And when I say a break, I don't mean, reading for 10 minutes and then taking a 30-minute break. What I mean is, let's say you're reading for 20 minutes or 25 minutes, and then you take a short 3 to 5 minute break. It could even just be a minute. You get out of your seat, you take a few deep breaths, you stretch a little bit, and then you get right back into it. Taking occasional breaks will help you focus a lot more, especially when you're reading that boring material. Now, what do you do when you're done with with reading your boring material? A lot of people, they say, well, I'm just going to be done with it. I closed the book. It was boring. I don't want to read anymore. But it's a good idea to review what you read. Now, you don't have to you could reread, but when I say reread, I mean you should reread those parts of the chapter where you really had a tough time. Or maybe you're not reading a chapter. What if you're reading a long article? Reread those parts or go over any graphs or diagrams. Reviewing what you read generally means three things. It could be reciting the information, so talking about it with somebody. So you might say, oh, the main idea of this paragraph is blah, 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 or they were talking about this. You talk about with somebody, or what you can do is you can reread parts, or you can even quiz yourself. A lot of times, if you're reading a textbook especially, there are questions at the end. It's a good idea to review what you just read. One other way you can do this is just flip backwards through the chapter and reread every heading, every subheading, every bold-faced word, and just make sure that you have a grasp of all those ideas. Now, tip number 18, we're on tip number 8 out of 15, is to set up some rewards for reading. So here's an interesting reward if you want to think about it this way. Gummy bears. When you reach a gummy bear, you get to eat it. Now, this was something funny I came across on the internet, but the principle of this is having some kind of reward. So maybe when you get to the end of a section, of course, this is probably not the healthiest way to read through a textbook, but when you get to the end of a section, maybe that gives you a chance to give a little break. Maybe you get to check your phone. Maybe at the end of a section or after a few pages, if you're trying to get fit, maybe you do push-ups every so often or some squats. Some people will do that to kind of get fit and also get your heart rate going, and that'll keep you focused as well. But whatever kind of a reward that you create for yourself, that'll help you look forward to that, and it'll help you move through the chapter with a better level of focus. Now, another way that you can focus better through boring material is to really find a study buddy. Find somebody that has to read the same thing at work or at school, and talk to them about it. Anytime you can discuss it with somebody, that's going to help you understand the material a lot better. Hopefully your study buddy is a lot more useful than the cartoon that you see on your screen here. But if you can find a study buddy, that is a very effective way to get through and understand that information, especially when the material is very dry. Tip number 10 is to get some background on the topic. So find some background information if you can. So for example, if you're reading a book that was that's a classic, I'm sure there's plenty of videos you can watch on the internet, or you can look up the Wikipedia page. Try to get some background on the topic before you start reading it. That's always helpful. That'll make it easier, and sometimes that'll make it less boring to read. Another thing you can do is to turn reading into a game. Now, for me, I grew up playing basketball, and as a result, I've always had a little bit of a competitive personality, and sometimes I'm competitive just with myself. What I mean by that is you can actually you can be competitive with yourself when you're reading. So here's one way you could do it. You time yourself. See how long it takes you to read one page of text in whatever it is you're reading. You take note of that time. Let's say you read through the page and it took you 1 minute. Or let's say it took you 1 minute and 10 seconds. Then you try to read another page and you try to beat your time. So if you read in 1 minute and 10 seconds last time, you try to see if you could beat that time this time around. And you keep doing this, and you're constantly keeping track. How long does it take me to read one page of text? That's one way that you can turn reading into a game of sorts. Or if 1 minute, one page, you could try, maybe doing 2 pages, see how long it does. You can vary this up, but the idea is that you kind of turn reading into some kind of a game and compete with yourself. Another really important thing, if you're reading boring material, you want to stay hydrated. Make sure you have some water nearby. Dehydration decreases your alertness. And if you haven't had enough water, it's going to be a lot harder to focus. And the fact that the material is boring, that's like a double whammy right there. Tip number 13 is to mind map the chapter. So if you're not familiar with mind maps, this is an example of a mind map that you see on your screen for the topic of time management. And mind maps are very visual. You don't have to be an artist. You can you can create very basic mind maps with text, or you can create them with more images. Generally, if you create the images, it's a lot better because you're using different parts of your brain. And this also allows you to, if you're reading very boring material, when you're mind mapping the chapter, it's kind of like outlining it, but in a very nonlinear way. And when you're doing this and you're taking notes, you're using other parts of your brain, and especially with boring material, this makes it a little less boring. Tip number 14 is when you have boring material, try to look around for lists. Anytime you see like step-by-step processes, or maybe you see bullet points anywhere, it's always a good idea to kind of be on alert for lists. So what I like to do before I start reading, while I'm flipping through and looking at headings and subheadings, bold-faced words, I'm also looking for any kind of bulleted lists or anything that has like a step-by-step process. And I'm watching for them because those usually tend to be very important. And tip number 15 is to focus on the outcome. So you want to have this mindset of, okay, this material is really boring, but what will I accomplish if I finish this? And keeping that in mind. Maybe you'll score really well on your test. Maybe you'll be able to finish this paper. Maybe you'll be able to free up time to do something else. And if you can focus on that outcome, it becomes a little easier to read through boring material. So I hope you found these tips helpful. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me by email. My email is paul@irisreading.com. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. But I hope you found this helpful. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. Thanks.